My name is Michael Harris, and for 14 years, I served as the financial elder at the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 7:30, I would unlock the steel filing cabinet in the back office, the one with the combination only 3 elders knew. The smell of old paper and that particular mustiness of a room that never quite gets enough air circulation would hit me as I sorted through donation reports, expense receipts, and correspondence from the branch office in Warwick, New York. I was 62 when my world collapsed. Not the kind of collapse you see in movies with dramatic music and shouting. No, it was quiet.
Like the sound a foundation makes when it finally gives way after years of invisible erosion. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because Thursday was always my day to organize the Judicial Committee files. Those manila folders containing the private confessions, disciplinary actions, and reinstatement records that make up the hidden backbone of any congregation. The autumn light was filtering through the narrow window, casting long shadows across my desk, when Brother Thompson brought in a cardboard box. "Financial records from the Circuit Assembly," he said, setting it down with a soft thud. "Brother Peters said you'd know where these go." Thompson was one of those elders who never looked you directly in the eye, always seemed to be studying something just over your shoulder. He'd been serving for nearly as long as I had, but we'd never been what you'd call close. In our organization, closeness was often seen as a liability. Too much familiarity could lead to questions, and questions could lead to doubt. "I'll take care of it," I replied, barely looking up from the monthly expense report I was reviewing. Thompson nodded and left without another word. It wasn't until after the evening meeting, when the Kingdom Hall had emptied and the parking lot lights were buzzing in that particular way fluorescent bulbs do when they're about to burn out, that I finally opened the box. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Carbon copies of deposit slips, receipts for sound equipment rentals, mileage reports from visiting speakers. But at the bottom, beneath a stack of contribution summaries, was a folder I'd never seen before. It was thicker than the others, bound with a red rubber band, and marked only with a small symbol in the corner. 3 intersecting lines forming something that looked almost like a trident, but not quite. I'd been handling congregation paperwork for over a decade, and I thought I knew every form, every code, every marking the organization used. I should have left it alone. Should have filed it away with the others and gone home to watch the evening news with Martha, my wife of 38 years. Should have trusted that if I wasn't supposed to see it, it wouldn't have been in a box meant for my attention. But curiosity has a way of growing in the silence of empty buildings, and the October wind was rattling the windows just enough to make me feel like the only person left in the world. I removed the rubber band and opened the folder. The first page made my hands go cold. It was a letterhead I recognized from our regional headquarters, but the content was unlike anything I'd ever seen in official correspondence. Names of congregation members, dates going back 15 years, and beside each entry, brief notations that made no immediate sense. Pastoral shield protocol, family unit preservation, public relations containment. The second page was worse. It contained photocopies of what appeared to be judicial committee decisions. But not the standard forms we used for documentation. These were different, more detailed, more clinical.
They listed not just the transgression and the decision, but also something called risk assessment and community impact evaluation. My breath was coming shallow now, the way it had during my heart episode 3 years earlier. But this wasn't a medical emergency. This was something else entirely. The feeling of standing at the edge of a precipice you didn't know was there. The third page contained a list of names I recognized. Brother Martinez, who'd been disfellowshipped 5 years ago for what we'd been told was apostasy. Sister Bennett, whose whole family had stopped coming to meetings after what the elders had described as personal spiritual struggles. The Anderson family, who'd moved away suddenly and whose absence had been explained as a geographical transfer for work purposes. Next to each name was a dollar amount and the notation, settlement, confidential. I sat there in the buzzing fluorescent light, staring at papers that seemed to prove everything I'd believed about our organization's transparency was a carefully constructed lie. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages, each one revealing more names, more numbers, more evidence of a system I'd never known existed. Outside, a car door slammed in the parking lot. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives, unaware that in a back office of a modest Kingdom Hall in Iowa, a man was discovering that his entire understanding of truth had been built on documents he was never supposed to see. If you've ever had a moment when your entire life suddenly makes sense in the worst possible way, you'll understand what I felt sitting there. If not, I hope you never do. I was born Michael Joseph Harris on March 15, 1961, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to parents who believed the world would end before I turned 21. My father, Robert Harris, was a construction worker who'd been baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in the early 60s, during what the organization called the Great Awakening. My mother, Dorothy, was the daughter of a Methodist minister who'd converted after a door-to-door visit that, according to family legend, lasted 7 hours. Growing up in the truth, that's what we called it, always with a capital T, meant that birthdays were forbidden, Christmas was pagan, and every Tuesday and Thursday night was spent at the Kingdom Hall listening to talks about the imminent end of this wicked system of things. I was baptized at 15, younger than most, but I'd always been what the elders called spiritually mature. By 19, I was a ministerial servant. By 25, I was appointed as an elder. Martha and I married in 1987, a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall with the reception held in the basement fellowship area. She was 22, the daughter of a prominent elder in Des Moines. With dark hair that she always kept neatly pinned back, and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. We'd been married 38 years when I found that folder, and in all that time, she'd never once questioned the organization's teachings, not publicly anyway. We'd tried for children for the first 10 years of our marriage, but they never came. The doctor said there was no medical reason, just one of those mysteries that modern medicine couldn't solve. Martha took it harder than I did, spending long hours in prayer and study, convinced that if she just had enough faith, Jehovah would bless us with a family. Eventually, we accepted that our service to the organization would be our legacy instead.
That acceptance had shaped both of us in ways I was only beginning to understand. Without children to protect, we'd thrown ourselves completely into congregation life. I'd volunteered for every committee, every building project, every judicial hearing that required a financial perspective.
Martha had pioneered, spent 90 hours a month in door-to-door preaching for the past 12 years. The morning after I found the folder, I woke at 5:30, same as always. Martha was already up, reading the daily text in her study chair by the kitchen window. The October morning light caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment she looked exactly like her mother had at that age, peaceful, devoted, unquestioning. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said without looking up from her Bible. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a baby," I lied, pouring coffee from the pot she'd started at 5:15, same as every morning for 38 years. But I hadn't slept at all. I'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of those papers, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood something. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained by decades of theocratic education, kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Maybe the folder was old, from some discontinued procedure. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error that had somehow made its way into current files. The problem was, I knew the organization's filing system better than almost anyone.
I'd helped design the current structure when we'd computerized our records in the late 90s. Every form had a purpose, every code had a meaning, and everything, absolutely everything, was supposed to be transparent, at least to those of us in leadership positions. Brother Thompson arrived at the Kingdom Hall that morning at 8 sharp, same as he had every Friday for the past 6 years. He was 71, a retired insurance adjuster who'd moved to Cedar Rapids from Chicago after his wife died. He had the kind of precise, methodical personality that made him perfect for keeping track of literature orders and territory cards. "Morning, Michael," he said, hanging his coat on the hook by the office door. "How did the assembly files work out?" The question was casual, but something in the way he asked it, a slight tightness around his eyes, a pause before he spoke, made me wonder if it really was casual at all. "Fine," I said. "Everything's filed away properly." "Good, good," he nodded, but his hands were fidgeting with the keyring he always carried, turning the keys over and over in a nervous pattern I'd never noticed before. Brother Peters mentioned there might have been some irregularities in the paperwork this year. Circuit assembly finances can be complicated. Peters was our circuit overseer, the traveling elder who visited our congregation twice a year to provide guidance and oversight. He was a thin man in his 50s with a gray beard and a habit of speaking in long, careful sentences that somehow managed to say nothing at all. "I didn't notice any irregularities," I said. Thompson's fidgeting stopped. "Well, that's reassuring. Sometimes these administrative procedures can be confusing for those of us who aren't familiar with all the protocols." There was that word again, protocols. The same word that had appeared on those papers, but now it was coming out of Thompson's mouth in a tone that suggested I should understand something I clearly didn't. "What kind of protocols?" I asked. For just a moment, Thompson's careful elder demeanor slipped, and I saw something else underneath. Not exactly fear, but a kind of weary resignation, like a man who'd been carrying a heavy load for too long. "Michael," he said, and his voice was gentler now, almost paternal. "There are aspects of organizational administration that are handled at levels above our congregation. Sometimes we see paperwork that's part of larger procedures we're not privy to. It's not a question of trust, it's a question of what? Of spiritual maturity,
of understanding that not every detail of how the organization protects itself and its members needs to be understood by everyone. The way he said protects itself made my stomach clench. Not protects its members, protects itself, as if the organization and its members were separate things with potentially separate interests. What was in that folder, Thompson? He was quiet for so long that I could hear the electric hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Collins Road, the settling of the building around us. "Nothing that concerns your responsibilities as financial elder," he said finally. "But it concerns someone's responsibilities." "Yes." "Whose?" Thompson walked to the window and stood looking out at the parking lot where, in a few hours, families would gather for the weekend meeting. Children would run across the pavement in their small suits and dresses. Parents would exchange pleasantries about the weather and their service experiences. And everyone would file into the main hall to hear about Jehovah's love and the importance of organizational loyalty.
"There are brothers who handle things that the rest of us don't need to worry about," he said. "Brothers who make sure that problems are resolved quietly before they can damage the reputation of God's organization." What kind of problems? The kind that could stumble other members if they became public knowledge. The phrase "stumble other members" was organization speak for causing someone to lose faith or leave the truth. It was one of the most serious accusations you could make against a fellow believer, that your words or actions had caused spiritual damage to someone else. And those brothers, they report to the branch office? Thompson turned back to me, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face.
He was a man caught between loyalty to the organization and something that looked suspiciously like a guilty conscience. "Michael, you're a good elder. You've served faithfully for 28 years. You've never caused problems, never asked difficult questions. Don't start now." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. That afternoon, I drove to the library and sat in the local history section, surrounded by books about Iowa farming and the development of the Cedar Rapids metropolitan area, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. The rational explanation was simple. The organization, like any large institution, probably had departments that handled sensitive legal matters. The folder I'd seen was likely just documentation of that process. Nothing sinister, nothing corrupt, just the kind of careful record-keeping that protected both the organization and its members from potential legal problems. But the irrational part of my mind, the part that had been trained to notice discrepancies in financial records, to spot the small inconsistencies that often revealed larger problems, kept returning to the specific details I'd seen. The settlement amounts, the risk assessments, the clinical language that described human suffering in terms of public relations management. And most disturbing of all, the growing certainty that Thompson's warning meant I was already seen as a problem that might need to be managed. As I sat there, surrounded by the musty smell of old books and the quiet sounds of other people pursuing their own research, I realized I was facing the kind of choice that defines the rest of your life. I could file away what I'd seen, continue serving faithfully, and trust that men wiser than myself were handling things appropriately. Or I could accept that my accidental glimpse behind the curtain had revealed something I couldn't ignore. The problem was, once you've seen the machinery behind the miracle, you can never quite believe in magic the same way again. The next 3 weeks passed like a fever dream. where everything looked normal on the surface while something toxic worked its way through my system underneath. I continued my elder duties, reviewing accounts, preparing financial reports, attending judicial committee meetings. But every conversation felt like I was performing in a play where I'd forgotten my lines. Martha noticed the change first. She had a way of reading my moods that came from decades of marriage. And by the second week, she was asking questions I couldn't answer. "You've been distracted lately," she said one evening as we prepared for the book study. "Is everything all right at the hall?" "Just busy with the quarterly reports," I replied, adjusting my tie in the hallway mirror. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was spending more time than usual going through financial records, but not for the reasons she assumed. Since finding that folder, I'd begun a systematic review of every financial document that had crossed my desk in the past 5 years. What I was looking for, I couldn't say exactly, but I had the growing suspicion that if one secret folder existed, there might be others. And if there were others, they might contain clues about what I'd stumbled into. The review process was painstaking work that I had to conduct during my lunch breaks and the quiet hours before morning meetings. Every receipt, every deposit slip, every correspondence with the branch office, I catalogued it all, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might explain the settlement amounts and risk assessments I'd seen. What I found was both more and less than I'd expected. More, because the financial irregularities were everywhere once you knew how to look for them. Donations that were recorded but never deposited. Expense reports for special projects that provided no detail about what the projects actually were. Transfer requests to something called the Ministerial Relief Fund that didn't appear in any organizational literature I could find. Less, because none of it was dramatic enough to constitute obvious fraud. Each individual transaction could be explained away as administrative complexity, poor record keeping, or legitimate organizational expenses that I simply wasn't authorized to understand. The problem was that when you added them all together, they formed a pattern of financial management that was far more opaque than anything I'd been taught to expect from God's organization. By the third week, I'd filled a small notebook with questions that I knew I couldn't ask anyone in the congregation. Not Thompson, who'd already warned me away from difficult questions. Not Peters, our circuit overseer, who was scheduled to visit next month and whose name had appeared on several of the mysterious transfer authorizations. Not even Brother Morrison, the presiding overseer, who'd been my closest friend in the elder body for the past 10 years. That realization that I couldn't trust any of my fellow elders with questions about what I'd discovered was almost more disturbing than the discoveries themselves. For 28 years, I'd believed that the elder body operated as a unified team, guided by Holy Spirit and committed to transparency in all our dealings. And now I was beginning to suspect that transparency, like so many other organizational principles, might have different meanings depending on your level of access. The first real break came on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was alone in the office, updating the congregation's financial software, when the phone rang. Kingdom Hall, this is Michael. Brother Harris, this is Janet Morrison from the legal department at the branch office. I knew the name. She'd been the contact person for several of the transfer authorizations I'd been questioning. Her voice had the kind of professional warmth that telephone customer service representatives use, friendly but somehow impersonal. "Good morning, Sister Morrison. How can I help you?" "I'm calling about some paperwork that may have been misfiled with your congregation's assembly reports. A folder marked with our internal processing symbol, 3 intersecting lines. We need to retrieve it as soon as possible." My hand tightened around the phone receiver. The folder was sitting in my desk drawer, where I'd kept it for the past 3 weeks while I tried to understand what it meant. "I'm not sure what folder you're referring to," I said. There was a pause, and when Morrison spoke again, the warmth in her voice had cooled several degrees.
"Brother Harris, this is a matter of organizational confidentiality. The folder contains sensitive legal documents that should never have left our offices. If it's in your possession, we need it returned immediately." "What kind of legal documents?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss that over the phone, but I can tell you that the information in that folder is protected by attorney-client privilege and could cause serious legal problems for the organization if it becomes public." Attorney-client privilege? The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I'd assumed the documents were some kind of internal administrative records, but attorney-client privilege meant they were related to actual legal proceedings, lawsuits, court cases. Things that the organization was defending against or settling out of court. "Brother Harris, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. We need that folder returned by the end of the week. I'm arranging for Brother Peters to pick it up during his next circuit visit." Peters again. Our circuit overseer was involved in whatever this was, which meant it wasn't just a local issue. This went up the organizational hierarchy, possibly all the way to the branch office in Warwick. "Of course," I said, "I'll make sure it's available when Brother Peters arrives." "Thank you, Brother Harris. And please remember that these documents are strictly confidential. Discussing their contents with anyone, even other elders, could result in serious consequences for both you and the organization." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and trying to process what I'd just learned. The folder contained legal documents protected by attorney-client privilege. The branch office was worried enough about its contents to make a special retrieval arrangement. And I'd been specifically warned not to discuss what I'd seen with anyone, even other elders. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done in 28 years as an elder. I made photocopies of confidential congregation documents. Not all of them. That would have taken hours and been impossible to hide. But the most significant pages from the folder, including the settlement lists and the risk assessment protocols. I told myself I was just being cautious, preserving evidence in case I needed to defend myself later. But the truth was simpler and more troubling. I no longer trusted the organization to tell me the truth about what I'd discovered. And I was beginning to suspect that whatever was in that folder was important enough that someone might try to make it disappear entirely. The photocopying had to be done at the public library, since the Kingdom Hall's copy machine logged every document that passed through it. I felt like a criminal, standing at the self-service station and feeding pages through the scanner. But I also felt something else. A kind of clarity that had been missing from my life for weeks. For the first time since I'd become an elder, I was acting on my own judgment rather than organizational protocol. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. That evening, I hid the photocopies in my home office, filed away behind tax returns and insurance policies where Martha would never think to look.
The original folder went back into my desk drawer at the Kingdom Hall, waiting for Brother Peters to retrieve it. But I couldn't stop thinking about Janet Morrison's phone call. Something about her tone, the specific way she'd emphasized the legal consequences of discussing the documents, suggested that this wasn't the first time the branch office had dealt with leaked confidential materials. They had a protocol for this situation, which meant it had happened before. How many other elders had accidentally stumbled across documents they weren't supposed to see?
And what had happened to them? The answer came from an unexpected source. Brother Anderson, an elder from a congregation in Des Moines, called me the following evening. We'd served together on a regional building committee 5 years earlier and had maintained a casual friendship since then. The kind of relationship where you exchange Christmas cards and catch up at circuit assemblies. "Michael, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," he said. His voice sounded strained, older than I remembered. "Not at all, Jim. How are you? How's the family?" "That's actually why I'm calling. I heard through the Elder Network that you might have come across some unusual paperwork recently."
The Elder Network was an informal communication system that connected congregation leaders across the circuit. It was supposed to be used for sharing encouragement and practical advice, but like any informal network, it sometimes carried information that wasn't supposed to be widely shared. "What makes you think that?" I asked. "Because the same thing happened to me 3 years ago. A folder that appeared in a batch of assembly reports, documents that didn't make sense, phone calls from the branch office about confidentiality and legal privilege." I could hear Anderson's wife talking in the background, and he covered the phone to respond to her before continuing. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you made any copies of what you found?" The question hung in the air between us. Anderson was asking me to confess to something that could be considered a serious violation of organizational trust, but he was also asking in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. "Why do you ask?" "Because if you have, you need to destroy them immediately, and you need to forget everything you think you saw." "What happened to you, Jim?" Another pause, longer this time. When Anderson spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "They transferred me to a congregation 200 miles away. Said it was for my own spiritual good, to help me refocus on pure worship. My wife had to quit her job. My kids had to change schools. And I had to sign a statement acknowledging that I'd made serious errors in judgment regarding confidential organizational matters." The implications of what he was telling me began to sink in. Anderson had been punished for discovering the same kind of documents I'd found. Not disfellowshipped, not publicly disciplined, but quietly relocated and forced to acknowledge wrongdoing for something that hadn't been his fault. "Did you ever find out what those documents were about?" "Legal settlements. Cases involving allegations of abuse that were handled internally rather than reported to authorities. Members who were paid to keep quiet about things that could have damaged the organization's reputation." There it was, stated plainly. The organization was paying people to keep quiet about abuse allegations. The settlement amounts I'd seen weren't administrative expenses, they were hush money. How many cases? In my folder, 17 over a 10-year period. Total settlements were just over $2 million. $2 million. The amount was staggering, but not as staggering as the realization that Anderson's folder had covered only 10 years in one region. How many other regions were there? How many other 10-year periods? "Jim, why are you telling me this?" Because I should have fought back when it happened to me. I should have asked questions, demanded answers, refused to sign their statement. Instead, I went along with it because I was afraid of what would happen to my family if I didn't. Anderson's wife was talking in the background again, more urgently this time. I have to go, Michael, but remember what I told you. If you want to keep your life intact, forget what you saw and move on. If you can't do that, well, be prepared for the consequences. The line went dead, leaving me alone in my study with the growing realization that my accidental discovery had placed me in the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about financial irregularities or administrative confusion. This was about systematic cover-ups of serious crimes. About an organization that was willing to pay millions of dollars to protect its reputation rather than protect its members. And I was now a threat to that system. The next morning brought another phone call, this one from Brother Peters himself. Michael, I understand you've been asking some questions about organizational procedures. I wouldn't say I've been asking questions, I replied. I've been doing my job, reviewing financial records as required. Of course, and we appreciate your diligence, but sometimes our enthusiasm for thoroughness can lead us into areas that are beyond our assigned responsibilities. Peters had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a gentle correction, even when he was delivering what amounted to a threat. What areas would those be? Legal matters that are handled by the branch office, financial arrangements that require a level of organizational authority that extends beyond the congregation level, documents that may appear to be part of normal administrative procedures but actually relate to confidential proceedings. He was being careful not to directly acknowledge that I'd seen anything specific, but the message was clear. Stop digging or face the consequences. I understand, I said. I'm glad to hear that. I'll be visiting your congregation next week for the circuit overseer's visit. Perhaps we can meet privately to discuss your ongoing responsibilities as financial elder. Of course. And Michael? I trust that your commitment to organizational loyalty will guide any decisions you make between now and then. Organizational loyalty. The phrase had always been presented as a virtue, a sign of spiritual maturity and trust in God's appointed representatives. But now, it sounded like something else entirely, a demand for blind obedience regardless of what that obedience might cost. After Peters hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the desk drawer that contained the folder I was supposed to return. In less than a week, he would arrive to collect it, and with it, any evidence of what I'd discovered. The photocopies hidden in my home office would remain, but without the originals, they could be dismissed as fabrications or misunderstandings. I thought about Anderson's story, about his forced relocation and the statement he'd been required to sign. I thought about the 17 cases in his folder and the $2 million in settlements. I thought about all the other folders that might exist, all the other elders who might have stumbled across evidence of crimes that were being covered up rather than reported. And I thought about what it would mean to simply hand over the folder and pretend I'd never seen its contents. That afternoon, confident, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for Peters to arrive and collect the folder, I was going to find someone outside the organization who could help me understand what I discovered. Someone who wasn't bound by organizational loyalty or afraid of the consequences of asking difficult questions. I was going to find a lawyer. The decision felt both inevitable and impossible. For 28 years, I'd been taught that the organization's internal procedures were sufficient for handling any problems that might arise. Where else would we go was more than just a rhetorical question. It was a fundamental worldview that placed ultimate trust in the organization's ability to police itself. But as I sat in that office, surrounded by financial records that documented years of systematic deception, I realized that the question had an answer I'd never been allowed to consider. We could go to people whose job it was to ensure that justice was served, regardless of which institution might be damaged in the process. The hardest part wouldn't be finding a lawyer or explaining what I'd discovered. The hardest part would be accepting that by seeking outside help, I was acknowledging that the organization I'd served faithfully for most of my adult life was not what it claimed to be, and that once I took that step, there would be no going back to the comfortable certainty of unquestioning faith. The law office of Patricia Hendricks was nothing like what I'd expected. Located in a converted Victorian house on the east side of Cedar Rapids, it felt more like visiting a friend's home than consulting with an attorney. The walls were lined with bookshelves, family photographs, and degrees from the University of Iowa Law School. Mrs. Hendricks herself was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse and seen every form of institutional cover-up that existed. I'd found her name through a web search for religious organization legal issues, and her website indicated she specialized in cases involving institutional abuse and cover-ups. What convinced me to call her was a quote on her homepage. When organizations place their reputation above the safety of their members, they forfeit the right to handle these matters internally. "So, Mr. Harris," she said, gesturing for me to sit in the leather chair across from her desk, "you mentioned on the phone that you've discovered some concerning documents related to your religious organization. Can you tell me more about what you found?" I'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times during the drive to her office, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you explain to someone who's never been part of a high-control religious group that questioning organizational authority feels like betraying God himself? "I serve as a financial elder for the local congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses," I began. 3 weeks ago, I accidentally received a folder containing documents that I believe show evidence of systematic cover-ups of abuse allegations." Mrs. Hendricks nodded and pulled out a legal pad. "What kind of documents?" I opened the manila envelope I'd brought and spread the photocopies across her desk. Settlement agreements, risk assessments that evaluate abuse allegations in terms of potential damage to the organization's reputation, lists of members who were paid to keep quiet about their experiences. She studied the papers for several minutes, occasionally making notes on her pad. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see something tightening around her eyes as she read. "Mr. Harris, these documents suggest that your organization has been systematically handling allegations of child sexual abuse through internal procedures, rather than reporting them to law enforcement. Are you aware that this is required by law in Iowa?" "I'm learning that now," I said, "but within our organization, we're taught that these matters should be handled by the elders first, to protect the reputation of God's name." "And what happens when the elders' investigation concludes that abuse has occurred?" "According to these documents, it depends on the risk assessment. If the case is likely to become public or create legal liability, settlements are arranged to ensure confidentiality." Mrs. Hendricks leaned back in her chair and studied me with that direct gaze. Mr. Harris, what you're describing is a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice. If these documents are authentic, they represent evidence of crimes that are still being committed. What you're describing is a criminal conspiracy. I'd known intellectually that what I discovered was wrong, but hearing it described in legal terms made the reality unavoidable. The organization I'd served faithfully for most of my adult life wasn't just making administrative mistakes, it was actively participating in criminal behavior. What would happen if I turned these documents over to law enforcement? Depends on several factors. Are the cases referenced in these documents still within the statute of limitations? Are there victims who would be willing to testify? Is there additional evidence beyond what you've provided? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. Then we need to find out. She reached for her phone. I'm going to connect you with Detective Sarah Martinez at the Cedar Rapids Police Department. She specializes in institutional abuse cases, and she'll know how to properly investigate what you found. My hands started shaking. Calling a lawyer had felt like a big step, but involving law enforcement made this real in a way I wasn't prepared for. Once I talked to the police, there would be no pretending this was just a misunderstanding or an administrative error. This would become an official investigation that could destroy everything I'd built my life around.
Mr. Harris, are you all right? I need you to understand something about my situation. If I do this, I'll lose everything. My wife, my friends, my entire social network. Everyone I care about will be told that I'm an apostate who turned against God's organization. I'll be shunned completely. Mrs. Hendricks set down the phone and leaned forward. I understand that this is an enormous decision, and I can't make it for you. But I can tell you this. Based on what you've shown me, there are children who have been abused, and your organization has prioritized its reputation over their safety. That's still happening right now, today, while we're sitting in this office having this conversation. She was right. And I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. For 28 years, I'd believed that the organization was God's chosen instrument on earth, that its leaders were guided by divine wisdom, that any apparent problems were either misunderstandings on my part or temporary issues that would be resolved through prayer and patience. Now, I was being asked to accept that everything I'd believed was not just wrong, but destructively wrong. That my faith had been used to enable crimes against children. That my loyalty had been exploited to maintain a system that prioritized institutional survival over human welfare. How long do I have to decide? I asked. Not long. You mentioned that someone from your organization is coming to collect these documents next week. Once they're gone, this opportunity might not come again. That evening, I sat in my study at home, surrounded by 38 years of marriage and 28 years of faithful service to an organization that I was now forced to see in an entirely different light. Martha was in the kitchen, preparing for our weekly family worship evening, unaware that her husband was contemplating a decision that would destroy the life we'd built together. At 8 o'clock, Brother Peters called. Michael, I wanted to confirm our meeting for tomorrow afternoon. I'll be at the Kingdom Hall at 3 o'clock to collect those documents we discussed. I'll be there, I said. Excellent. And Michael, I want you to know that the branch office appreciates your discretion in this matter. Your loyalty to the organization during this delicate situation has been noted at the highest levels. Loyalty. There was that word again, but now it sounded different.
Not like a virtue, but like a trap. Thank you, Brother Peters. I'll see you tomorrow, and remember, some knowledge is too dangerous for those who aren't prepared to handle it responsibly. After he hung up, I sat in the silence of my study and realized that I'd already made my decision. The question wasn't whether to turn over the documents. The question was whether to live the rest of my life as someone who had seen evidence of systematic child abuse and done nothing about it. The next morning, I called Detective Martinez. Detective Martinez, this is Michael Harris. I was referred to you by Patricia Hendricks. I have documents that I believe show evidence of child abuse cover-ups by the Jehovah's Witnesses organization. Can you bring those documents to the police station this afternoon, Mr. Harris? Yes, but there's something you need to know. Someone from the organization is coming to collect the original documents at 3 o'clock. If we're going to do this, it has to be before then. I can meet you at 1 o'clock. Will that work? Yes. Mr. Harris, are you prepared for the consequences of what you're about to do? I thought about Anderson's story, about his forced relocation and destroyed career. I thought about the 17 abuse victims in his folder, and the unknown number of victims in other folders that might exist. I thought about Martha, who would have to choose between her husband and her faith. I thought about the life I was about to lose and the lives that might be saved. Yes, I said, I'm prepared. At 12:30 that afternoon, I walked into the Cedar Rapids Police Department carrying a manila envelope that contained photocopies of documents that would eventually lead to a federal investigation. Multiple indictments, and a complete restructuring of how religious organizations in Iowa are required to handle abuse allegations. But at that moment, all I knew was that I was about to cross a line that would change everything about who I was and how I understood the world. I was about to stop being Brother Harris, loyal elder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and become Michael Harris, witness to crimes that someone needed to answer for. The transformation was terrifying and necessary and completely irreversible. Detective Martinez was waiting for me in interview room 3.
Detective Martinez was a compact woman in her 40s, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd seen enough institutional cover-ups to know exactly what she was looking at. She spread my photocopied documents across the interview room table and studied them with the same methodical attention I'd once given to financial reports, but her focus was on names, dates, and patterns of behavior rather than dollar amounts. Mr. Harris, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you shared these documents with anyone else within your organization? No, I was specifically warned not to discuss them with anyone, even other elders. And the original documents? They're still in your possession? Yes, but not for long. Brother Peters, our circuit overseer, is coming to collect them at 3 o'clock today. Detective Martinez checked her watch. That gives us about an hour and a half. I'm going to call in Detective Williams from our Crimes Against Children unit, and we're going to need you to walk us through everything you know about how your organization handles these situations. The next hour was the most difficult of my life up to that point. Explaining the judicial committee process, the two-witness rule, the emphasis on organizational reputation, it all sounded so clinical and reasonable when described in theoretical terms. But when Detective Williams started asking about specific cases from the documents,
about children who had been abused and then required to confront their abusers in closed-door meetings.
The full horror of what I'd been part of began to sink in. According to this risk assessment, Detective Williams said, pointing to one of the photocopied pages, a 12-year-old girl reported being molested by her stepfather, who was also an elder in the congregation. The committee concluded that the allegation was credible, but decided against reporting it to authorities because it would bring reproach on Jehovah's name. Instead, they arranged for the stepfather to resign his position quietly and the family to relocate to another state. Is that your understanding of what happened? I stared at the document, reading the clinical language that reduced a child's trauma to a public relations problem. Yes, that appears to be what happened.
And the settlement amount listed here, $45,000? That was paid to ensure the family's silence? That's what it looks like. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Mr. Harris, we're going to need the original documents to pursue this investigation. Are you prepared to hand them over to us instead of returning them to your organization? The question hung in the air between us. Giving the documents to the police would be an irreversible act of betrayal against the organization that had shaped my entire adult life, but returning them would make me complicit in covering up crimes against children. Yes, I said, I'll bring you the originals. There's something else you need to understand, Detective Williams said. Once we begin this investigation, your cooperation will likely become public knowledge. Religious organizations have ways of finding out when their members have spoken to law enforcement. What does that mean for me? It means your organization will almost certainly take action to discredit you. They'll claim you're mentally unstable, spiritually weak, or motivated by personal grievances. They'll encourage other members to shun you completely, and they'll do everything they can to minimize the impact of what you're reporting. I thought about Anderson's forced relocation, his family's shattered life, his warning about the consequences of fighting back. But I also thought about the 12-year-old girl whose abuse had been treated as a public relations problem, and about all the other children whose names appeared in those documents. I understand, I said. At 2:15, I returned to the Kingdom Hall to collect the original documents from my desk drawer. The building was empty except for Brother Thompson, who was in the main hall arranging chairs for the evening meeting. He looked up as I entered the office. "Afternoon, Michael. Brother Peters called to confirm he'll be here at 3. "I know. I'm just getting the documents ready for him." Thompson studied my face with the kind of careful attention that elders develop for detecting spiritual problems. "You look tired. Everything all right?" "Just a long week." "These administrative matters can be draining," he said. "But it's important to remember that we don't always need to understand everything about how the organization operates. Sometimes faithful obedience is more valuable than complete comprehension." I nodded and waited for him to return to his chair, arranging before opening the desk drawer. The folder was exactly where I'd left it, its red rubber band and strange symbol unchanged. But as I lifted it out, my hands started shaking with the realization that I was about to commit an act that would mark me as an apostate in the eyes of everyone I'd ever called friend. Instead of waiting for Peters to arrive, I walked out of the Kingdom Hall for the last time as Brother Michael Harris. Faithful elder. By the time Peters knocked on the office door at 3 o'clock, I was already at the police station, handing over original documents to Detective Martinez. Martha was in the garden when I arrived home at 4:30, tending to the late-season tomatoes she'd been nursing through the first light frosts of October. She looked up as I approached, and I could see in her expression that something in my demeanor had changed. "How was your day, sweetheart?" "We need to talk," I said. The conversation that followed was the hardest of our 38-year marriage.
I explained about the documents, about the cover-ups, about the police investigation that was now beginning. Martha listened in silence, her face growing paler with each detail I shared. "Michael, what have you done?" "I've reported evidence of crimes to law enforcement. But the organization has procedures for handling these matters. There are reasons why these things are kept confidential. You don't understand the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that children are being abused and the organization is covering it up to protect its reputation." Marcia set down her gardening gloves and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a kind of desperate confusion, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that don't fit. The elders would never allow children to be harmed. If there were problems, they would be handled appropriately. "I've seen the documents, Martha. I know what's been happening." "Then maybe you misunderstood what you saw. Maybe there's an explanation that you haven't considered." I realized then that no amount of evidence would convince her to question the organization's integrity. Her faith wasn't based on facts that could be disputed. It was based on a worldview that made questioning the organization equivalent to questioning God himself. "What happens now?" she asked. "The police will investigate. If they find evidence of crimes, there will be arrests and prosecutions. And the organization will almost certainly disfellowship me for apostasy." "And us?" I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I don't know, Martha. That depends on what you decide to do." That evening, Brother Peters called. His voice was different now, still controlled, but with an edge of barely contained anger. "Michael, I went to the Kingdom Hall to collect those documents, but they weren't available. Brother Thompson said you'd taken them earlier." "That's correct." "Where are they now?" "With the proper authorities." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice cold. "Michael, you have made a very serious mistake. The documents you took belong to the organization, and by removing them without authorization, you have violated your oath as an elder and committed what amounts to theft of confidential materials. The documents contain evidence of crimes against children. The documents contain confidential legal materials that are protected by attorney-client privilege. Your theft of those materials has potentially compromised ongoing legal strategies designed to protect the organization from frivolous lawsuits." It was masterful doublespeak, taking criminal evidence and reframing it as legal strategy, taking my cooperation with law enforcement and reframing it as theft. But I was no longer impressed by the organization's ability to manipulate language to avoid responsibility. "Brother Peters, children have been abused, and instead of reporting those crimes to police, the organization has paid money to keep victims quiet. That's not legal strategy, that's criminal conspiracy. Michael, you are speaking like an apostate. I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider your position. Return those documents, make a formal apology for your unauthorized actions, and submit to spiritual counseling. If you do this within the next 24 hours, we might be able to resolve this matter quietly. And if I don't, then you will face a judicial committee on charges of apostasy, theft of organizational property, and bringing reproach on Jehovah's name. The outcome of such a committee is not difficult to predict." After he hung up, I sat in my study, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I was in the process of losing. Photos from circuit assemblies, plaques recognizing years of faithful service, books and magazines that had shaped my understanding of truth for nearly 3 decades. All of it felt suddenly hollow, like props in a play I'd been performing without realizing I was acting. The next morning brought a phone call from Detective Martinez. "Mr. Harris, we've reviewed the documents you provided, and we're opening a formal investigation. We're also going to need you to provide a detailed statement about your role in the organization's financial operations and what you observed regarding the handling of abuse allegations."
Of course. There's something else. We've received a call from an attorney representing your organization. He's claiming that you stole confidential legal documents and that any investigation based on those documents would be illegally obtained evidence. I'd expected this, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the stomach. The organization was moving quickly to discredit both me and any investigation that might result from my cooperation. What does that mean for the investigation? It means we need to be very careful about how we proceed. The documents you provided give us probable cause to seek additional evidence through legal channels, but we can't rely solely on materials that were obtained without proper authorization.
So, what happens next? We continue investigating, but we build our case on evidence we obtain through proper legal procedures. Your documents pointed us in the right direction, but we need to find corroborating evidence that can't be dismissed as stolen materials. That afternoon, I received a call from Brother Morrison, the presiding overseer of our congregation and my friend for the past 10 years. "Michael, I've been asked to inform you that a judicial committee has been scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. You're being charged with apostasy, theft of organizational property, and conduct bringing reproach on God's name." His voice was formal, mechanical, like he was reading from a script.
The warmth that had characterized our friendship for a decade was completely absent. "Will you be on the committee, Brad?" "No. The branch office has assigned 3 elders from outside our circuit to ensure objectivity." Objectivity meant elders who didn't know me personally, who wouldn't be influenced by years of friendship or knowledge of my character. It meant the outcome had already been decided, and the committee was just a formality. "I understand. Michael, for what it's worth, I hope you'll reconsider your position before Thursday. It's not too late to make this right." But it was too late, and we both knew it. I'd crossed a line that the organization could never forgive.
And no amount of reconsideration would change that. The only question now was whether I would try to defend myself at a committee meeting that was designed to be a judicial execution, or whether I would simply accept the inevitable outcome. That evening, as Martha and I sat in our living room reading our respective publications, she with her watchtower, me with the police report I was preparing, I realized that we were already living in different worlds. She was still in the one where the organization was God's chosen instrument on earth. I was now in the one where it was a criminal conspiracy that had used our faith to enable child abuse. The distance between those worlds was growing wider every day, and I was beginning to understand that it might soon become impossible to bridge. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me grateful for another season of life in Iowa. But as I walked into Kingdom Hall's back room at 7 o'clock, facing 3 elders I'd never met before, I felt like I was attending my own funeral. The committee chairman was a tall, gray-haired man named Elder Richardson, who spoke with the practiced authority of someone who'd conducted dozens of these proceedings. The other 2 elders, Brothers Walsh and Kowalski, flanked him like silent sentinels, their expressions carefully neutral but somehow predetermined. "Brother Harris," Richardson began, consulting a manila folder that I suspected contained a detailed report from the branch office, "you've been charged with serious violations of Christian conduct. Do you understand the nature of these charges?"
I understand that I'm being punished for reporting crimes to law enforcement. You're being charged with apostasy, theft of organizational property, and conduct that brings reproach on Jehovah's name. How do you respond to these charges? I'd prepared for this moment, but sitting in that sterile room under those fluorescent lights, surrounded by men who'd already decided my fate, the words felt inadequate. I found evidence that children in our organization have been sexually abused.
And instead of reporting those crimes to police, the organization has been paying victims to remain silent. When I discovered this, I did what any moral person should do. I reported it to the proper authorities. Elder Walsh leaned forward. Serious. Brother Harris, do you believe that Jehovah's organization is capable of handling these matters appropriately through internal procedures? I believe that when children are being abused, the only appropriate response is to immediately contact law enforcement. Anything else is a betrayal of those children. So you're saying that you know better than the faithful and discreet slave class that Jehovah has appointed to guide his people? There it was, the theological trap that made questioning organizational policy equivalent to questioning God himself. For 28 years, I would have struggled to answer that question without appearing faithless. Now the answer seemed obvious. I'm saying that no human organization has the authority to cover up crimes against children, regardless of what religious authority it claims to possess. The three elders exchanged glances that confirmed what I already knew. The outcome had been decided before I'd even entered the room. Brother Harris, Richardson said, it's clear that you've developed an apostate mentality that places your own judgment above that of God's organization. Unless you're prepared to acknowledge your error, express genuine repentance, and commit to supporting organizational procedures without reservation, we have no choice but to disfellowship you. I'm not repentant for protecting children. Then this committee is concluded. And just like that, 30 years of my life as one of Jehovah's Witnesses ended. No dramatic confrontation, no emotional appeals, just a bureaucratic decision that would erase me from the only community I'd ever known. Martha was waiting in the parking lot when I emerged from the Kingdom Hall. She'd been attending the evening meeting in the main auditorium, and her face told me she already knew the outcome. "They announced your disfellowshipping," she said quietly. "Brother Morrison read a statement saying that Michael Harris is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses." We drove home in silence, both understanding that our marriage had just become something neither of us knew how to navigate. Martha couldn't associate with a disfellowshipped person, not even her husband, without risking her own standing in the congregation. I couldn't pretend to regret the decision I'd made, even knowing what it would cost us both. "What happens now?" she asked as we pulled into our driveway. "Now you have to decide whether you can live with being married to someone the organization considers dead." Martha moved out the following week, staying with her sister in Des Moines while she decided whether our marriage could survive my apostasy. The house felt enormous without her, filled with echoes and memories of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. But the isolation wasn't complete. Detective Martinez called regularly with updates on the investigation, and gradually I began to understand that my cooperation had opened something much larger than I'd imagined. The documents I'd provided had led to search warrants for branch office records, which had revealed similar patterns in congregations across 3 states. Other victims had come forward. Other elders had provided additional evidence.
6 months after my disfellowshipping, the first arrests were made.
Not of local elders. They were treated as victims of a system that had pressured them into silence, but of regional administrators who had designed and implemented the policies I'd discovered. The charges included conspiracy to obstruct justice, aiding and abetting child abuse, and racketeering under laws designed to combat organized crime. The media coverage was extensive and devastating. Reporters who'd spent months investigating found evidence of systematic cover-ups spanning decades, involving hundreds of cases and millions of dollars in settlement payments. The organization's carefully maintained image of moral authority collapsed under the weight of documented evidence that it had prioritized its reputation over the safety of children.
Martha returned home after 8 months, thinner and sadder, but no longer torn between loyalty to her faith and love for her husband. The congregation had made that decision for her by suggesting that her marriage to an apostate was itself a form of spiritual contamination. "I lost my faith," she told me one evening as we sat in our living room, surrounded by boxes of Watchtower publications that she'd finally decided to pack away. "Not in God, but in the organization I thought represented him. I kept waiting for them to explain how protecting child abusers served some greater spiritual purpose, but the explanation never came." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We figure out how to build a life that's not controlled by people who claim to speak for God, but act like they're running a corporation." It wasn't easy. At 63 and 64, we were starting over, without the social network, belief system, or sense of purpose that had defined our entire adult lives. But we were starting over together, and without the constant pressure to conform to organizational expectations that neither of us had realized was there until it was gone. Today, 3 years later, I work part-time as a financial consultant for small businesses, helping them establish the kind of transparent record-keeping practices that I'd always thought the Watchtower organization maintained. Martha volunteers at a local literacy center, teaching adults to read with the same patience she once brought to Bible studies. We found a small Episcopal church where questions are encouraged rather than feared, where transparency is valued over reputation, and where protecting children is considered more important than protecting institutions. It's not the same as the certainty we once felt, but it's honest in a way our former faith never was. Sometimes former witnesses contact me, people who've heard about the investigation and want to share their own experiences of abuse or cover-ups. I listen, offer what support I can, and, when appropriate, connect them with the attorneys and advocates who are continuing to hold the organization accountable.
The folder I found that October afternoon was never returned to the branch office. It sits now in an FBI evidence locker, along with thousands of other documents that tell the story of an organization that lost its way so completely that it began treating child abuse as a public relations problem rather than a crime. I think often about the 12-year-old girl whose abuse was reduced to a risk assessment, about the 17 victims in Anderson's folder, about the hundreds of others whose suffering was hidden away in similar files. Their courage in finally speaking publicly has begun to change how religious organizations handle these situations, and their testimony has led to laws requiring mandatory reporting that can't be overridden by claims of religious privilege.
Every day brings new challenges as Martha and I learn to live authentically rather than according to someone else's interpretation of divine will. But every morning I wake up knowing that I'm no longer part of a system that harms children to protect itself, and that knowledge makes everything else bearable. This is a real story shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.